Hello, everybody, and welcome to Box Seat Banter. I'm your host, Billy Ballas, a baseball coach. Been coaching for over a decade now, a season ticket holder, big fan of baseball, love talking about baseball. And today I am talking about the Chicago White Sox. And joining me today, Brett Valentini. He is the managing editor for the Southside Sox. He also hosts a podcast for the Southside Sox. He has an extensive background, acting, musician, huge wiffle ball fan, big wiffle ball player, Nerf hoops. He's even been a bilingual kindergarten teacher, and he's covered a lot of sports, hockey, NBA, MLB. He covered the Chicago Blackhawks. He was their beat writer when they won the Stanley Cup. He's been on the White Sox beat. He's got a book out on Ozzie Guillen. So he's got a lot of information that he's bringing to the podcast today. Brett, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me, Billy. When you list it all out that way, it sounds sort of exciting. Sounds more exciting than I remember it being.
Yeah, and we're at the home plate from the old Comiskey Park as we're talking about the White Sox. It's nice that it is still kind of, preserved there. They have that marked off there. Unfortunately, the ballpark is not there anymore, but home plate is still here.
In a parking lot, of all places, in a parking lot. But yeah, it is still there. And Billy, as you know, I've been around long enough to remember both parks, and there was I've seen pretty much every park, maybe not a lot of the new ones, but I've seen games in every park in baseball, and really nothing topped to me Comiskey Park. It's your first park, so that's the one you fall in love with. But it's just a phenomenal place to watch a game. And, thankfully, New Comiskey and whatever it's turned into now, I just call it Sox Park, has turned into a real nice place to see a game, too. But when it first was erected, wow, it was a real shock to the system.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a moment. When we look back at the White Sox, they were one of the charter members of the American League all the way back in 1901. Prior to that, they played in some of the other leagues before the American League was formed there. They bounced around. They had some different names. I think Comiskey bought them from, they might have moved around. I forget. But they were the Chicago White Stockings back then, originally in 01. Then it was shortened to the White Sox in 04. And I think the original White Stockings were the team that ended up to be the Cubs. Is that correct?
Yep, they took the I guess the familiarity or whatever. Yeah, they took the former Cubs name when they came into Chicago, right, from out of town, and even technically won the pennant in 1900. They just weren't recognized as a major league. So,
and they do people in Chicago? Is that an odd thing to have them? Do people know that the Cubs were originally the White Stockings way back in like the 1800s?
I mean, Billy, I don't know if you've talked. I don't know if you've done the Cubs yet on this. I'm sure whoever you talked to is very knowledgeable. Let's face it, Cubs fans are not typically super knowledgeable. So I would say no. They probably know all the selections of beer in all of the vendors. However, no, they probably don't recognize that, and that the rivalry actually goes, before to the point where before the White Sox even really existed. So
yeah. And so that was interesting. I did do the Cubs podcast, and I had not known that the Cubs were originally that. So that was news to me. As you mentioned, Comiskey Park, they played in Comiskey Park from 1910 to 1990. And, New Comiskey, whatever you want to call it, it's got that beautiful name of Guaranteed Rate Fields now. They've been in there since 91. So, Comiskey Park, unfortunately, it's no longer standing. It did not get, like the Fenway treatment or the Wrigley treatment. How disappointed are people around Chicago for that? It seems like, a couple weeks ago, we talked about the Tigers, and Tiger Stadium kind of had the same fate.
Yeah, I think that's a good parallel. And imagine if you were to try to suggest tearing down, even rebuilding Fenway Park or Wrigley Field, and the resistance that would get. Unfortunately, both for New Comiskey Park and the old the decision to tear it down came right before sort of the wave of nostalgia
Right.
and these more retro parks came up. So that didn't benefit the White Sox in building anew, and it certainly didn't benefit in any kind of push to have the park preserved. From the start, the New Sox ownership pretty much said they recognized the place was sort of a dump and it wasn't worth trying to preserve. I think you could probably meet a lot of people, including myself, who'd provide a lot of resistance to that notion that you couldn't at least have and incorporated something and preserved the park to some degree. Today I'm not sure anybody cares too much because a lot of those fans aren't around to shake their tiny fists about it any longer. But at the time, a complete shock to the system. And, again, the photo I'd even sent you where, you've got the juxtaposition of this strange UFO looking thing being built next to. And I imagine a lot of people were caught up in the excitement of a new park. And at the same time, don't look across the fence to the neighbor all the time, because yes, what seemed like it might be new and exciting, you lose a lot in that process too.
Yeah, and so they open up that new field, and then it's a new field. I'm sure a lot of the fans, I'm sure, missed the old Comiskey, but some people probably like the shiny new thing, right? And then shortly thereafter, Camden Yards opens in Baltimore and starts this whole new trends of ballparks, and people were like, wait, that's what a new ballpark's supposed to look like?
The very next year, and by the same architects. So it's almost as if they said, our last plan that sort of stinks, we're going to give you Chicago, but we've got this exciting new wing of the building where all the artists are. And it was, obviously Baltimore must have had some role in steering how they wanted their park to look, and likewise with the White Sox, and they just took two very different directions. And though again, the White Sox did do a bunch of renovations when they first rebranded to I can't remember now, but Guaranteed Rate, I don't know, whatever it was. No, Guaranteed Rate is what it is now. US Cellular Field came in with a bunch of money, and they they did renovate. They lopped off that weird UFO looking top of the field, made it a little more intimate. The park's a great park now, no doubt about it. When it opened, it was still still all right and new, but it did, a lot of criticism was it had a shopping mall vibe, not something you could exactly not see. But that comes with some benefits too. It certainly was a more workable, livable, breathable park than Comiskey Park was, where you might have a seat behind a support barrier and such. So the timing wasn't great for the White Sox in terms of they're just a year off of what really became this new vanguard, which is still going today, of new parks.
Yeah, and they still got the pinwheels on the scoreboard out there, right?
They do. They did incorporate a lot of the stuff, and they even literally brought over like the shower from the old Comiskey Park that Bill Veeck had put up in center field. They brought over, it's more sequestered again. It's a little bit more mollified or museumified, but there are elements. Nancy Faust came over from the old park and still played for years after that. There are a lot of elements, and the White Sox fans are still the White Sox fans. So.
Yeah, and so in that new park, they've got 3 AL Central titles. They won it in 2000, 05, and 08, and then they also won the wild card just this past year in 2020. One of the what were there? Well, I guess there were 2 technically wild card. Or were they the second place team in the Central?
They were third place, actually. Okay. They decided to punt the entire last week of the season.
Right,
and almost fell out of the playoffs, so they just made the cut.
And in this past quarter century that we look at, they've got 1 AL pennant. That was in 05. They've got 6 total. They also won the World Series in 05. Obviously, their only World Series win, since they've got the 1 pennant in the past quarter century, and they've got 3 total World Series wins. The others back in 06 and 1917. That 06 one was an all Chicago series as they beat the Cubs, the 116 win Cubs. And then they won in 1917. So 3 World Series totals. What was that 05 World Series like?
Oh, it was great. I mean, I was lucky enough to be there for the entire playoff run. Really nice seats right in front of Nancy Faust, actually. With my dad, who brought me into White Sox fandom, and going into it, all I was hoping was to win a playoff series. I mean, really, that's how low the expectations were for White Sox fans, because we hadn't done it since 1917.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the fact that they just blew past that, the run they had, which is unparalleled beyond, I think, a Yankees season with the only one loss in this divisional era, the run they had with the 4 complete games,
Mm-hmm.
just some extraordinary stuff. So yeah, the fact that, and I don't think I was the only fan who went in just saying, hey, can we win a playoff game? Can we win a playoff series? And then to have shoot past that to the point where it's like, these guys aren't going to lose, was something, of course, very unfamiliar. But also, yeah, I mean, come on, when you're on that roller coaster ride, it's delightful. So yeah, it was an incredible thrill, and thank goodness we have it, because it's been a tough stretch.
And I know people talked about, now they're over, but there was, the curse of the Billy Goat with the Cubs not having won since 1908, and then the curse of the Bambino with the Red Sox, not having won since 1918. Did people really talk about, it seems like outside of Chicago, the White Sox didn't get a lot of talk about that drought since going back to 1917. Of course, they've had the Black Sox scandal in 1919. Was that a big thing in Chicago among the White Sox fans, this huge, long drought?
Well, I'm sure the Cubs fans didn't like the fact that the Sox were the ones who broke a drought before they did, and we're smart fans on the South Side, so we don't really go in for all the, the tarot card readings and all that kind of stuff. Curses, they're just a bad team for a long time. They're a team, but also had a stretch from 1951 to 1967 of winning seasons that was unparalleled in baseball, even with the New York Yankees. So it's a team that I think had a history of coming close, but not really being able to push over.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, even though we didn't have something cute like a goat or a Bambino to circle around, of course, it was a huge weight lifted off of any fan's shoulders, and of course, immediately, almost immediately, all the national news outlets, as you say, the White Sox don't seem to get top billing in Chicago much these days, and really even nationally. There's been a number of times ESPN in particular has just completely forgotten the White Sox even won a World Series. They'll list championships won, say, in the last quarter century, and that White Sox aren't even on there because Cubs 11 years, I believe, 10 years maybe later win, so that sort of tends to overshadow the fact that these 2 streaks were broken. But yeah, the White Sox did do it first, and yeah, there wasn't a lot of circus-like atmosphere around it. We just won. Killed the opposition in the process and, brought home a trophy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they had a long drought. The Red Sox ended their drought in 2004. And then the White Sox followed suit, had to stay with their Sox brothers there and ended their drought the following year. And yeah, you mentioned, the history of those several winning seasons. They do have some great players who have played for them. Some of their retired numbers include 2 for Nellie Fox, 3 for Harold Baines, recently inducted into the Hall of Fame, Harold Baines, 4, Luke Appling, 9, the great Minnie Minoso, 11, Luis Aparicio. I mean, these are some, huge names, especially in the Latin community. 14 for Paul Konerko, 16 for Ted Lyons. Billy Pierce's number 19 is retired. The Big Hurt, Frank Thomas, number 35. 56 for Mark Burley, and 72 for Carlton Fisk. And then, of course, 42 for Jackie Robinson, which is retired throughout baseball. I mean, some impressive names here. And again, in the Latin community, well represented there. Luis Aparicio, just a legend among them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, of course, you have the odd novelty, which I would say is maybe unprecedented across baseball and maybe all of sports. Harold Baines getting his number retired after being traded away while he's still a player. And he even came back to the White Sox with a retired number on the wall. He's playing for the White Sox twice more. So a very strange decision to retire that number, but certainly an honor worthy and, a Hall of Famer now. And he's got a statue in the outfield concourse as well.
Yeah, maybe wait until the guy retires before he retire his number. So yeah, it's a look at some of the past, some of the history of the White Sox, and we'll get into some of the personnel in just a moment here. Last week on the show, we talked about the Royals, and one of my favorite parts of the show is a trivia question. last week's question on the Royals was about their World Series championship in 2015 and who were the American League Championship Series, the ALCS, and the World Series MVPs for the Royals in 2015. Brett, do you have a guess on that?
Gosh, they had such an unsung, unheralded team.
Yeah.
I'm going to say maybe World Series was Salvador Perez, and I don't know, maybe Escobar was the ALCS. I don't know.
Wow. I mean, you hit it right there. Yeah. You nailed it, both of them.
I'm going to lose my White Sox fan credibility for knowing much about the Royals.
Yeah, and last week's guest also got those correct. I want to point out that, but yeah, that's a great pull there. Escobar was the ALCS MVP and Salvador Perez, the World Series MVP, which brings us to this week's trivia question about the White Sox. And I'm flipping it. Instead of talking about the end of the season, I'm talking about the beginning of the season for the White Sox. And when I looked at their opening day starters, both position players and pitchers, there were two positions that really stuck out to me with some stability. And at first base, in the past quarter century, Frank Thomas, Paul Konerko, and Jose Abreu have been the opening day starter at first base every year except for 1998. And Frank Thomas actually started at DH on opening day in 98. So can you tell me who started at first base on opening day in 98?
Man, that's a good one. Because, you have the first base stability, and Big Hurt was definitely playing his way off of first base by that time. Boy, it would be some weird choice like a Ross Gload or a Greg Norton or I cannot tell you. That would be a really good one to know. And now I feel extremely embarrassed that I know a Kansas City Royals answer. Though this one's more obscure.
This is very obscure.
No, I do not have I do not have a definitive answer. And
do you want to throw a guess out there?
I'm going to say Greg Norton, even though he's a third baseman.
Okay, and then the second part, like I said, the other position that there's a lot of stability was the opening day starting pitcher. And that's, of course, Mark Buehrle, who was the opening day starting pitcher every year from 2002 to 2011, except for 2007. So who was their opening day starter in 2007?
I'm gonna say it's Javier Vasquez, but only because he came in with a little bit more. He wasn't the surprise guy that oftentimes some of the Sox stars. I mean, we'll get to talking about that soon, I'm sure. But because he had a little bit of hype, I'm going to say Javier Vasquez, but I don't even say that with a ton of confidence.
Okay, so those are Brett's guesses. I will reveal the answer next week. So listeners, if you want to throw your guesses out there, go ahead, chime in on social media. It's at Box Seat Banter on both Twitter and Instagram. Throw your guesses out there on the trivia question. And again, answer will be revealed on the program next week. Now let's get into some of the important people in that front office and owner's box there for the White Sox. Now continuing with that stability, they've had a lot of stability in the ownership. Jerry Reinsdorf has been the owner since 1981. How is he as an owner? What do you think on him?
Well, you can't argue too much in that he did bring a World Series to the White Sox. People have a lot of quibble with Jerry Reinsdorf and his spending. He does treat the White Sox as a small market team, arguably, although there are years that the White Sox have been certainly in the top 10 in spending. That's a big stickler for fans. And I think this offseason's another time where I suppose fans have been pretty critical, given not just the amount of spending, or maybe more than the amount of spending, but how it was spent. So Jerry's a guy who professes he wants to win. You can't argue between his Bulls tenure and White Sox tenure that he's brought home championships. So the criticism, I think, has to stop at the door at some point. But I think, as with probably any owner, he has left himself open to plenty of criticism. So I think you might be able to characterize it as just not probably unique among fan bases. It's a love-hate relationship with ownership. But you can say there has been stability, and there hasn't been embarrassments, as you've seen perhaps, in New York and some other places where fans actually are like, man, this guy owns our team. So, low point, I suppose, being the most hawkish of owners. Right around the time the White Sox were perhaps tapping into a World Series, 11 years before they eventually did win it in '94. A lot of fans still harbor a lot of resentment against Reinsdorf for, shutting baseball down in a year that they were on the cusp of perhaps doing something great with a real great core that they couldn't get back once baseball came back. So let's just be polite and say love-hate.
And I think we may come back on him in a short moment when we get to the manager discussion. But yeah, so Reinsdorf, again, a lot of stability there, has owned the team and has been a big figure in Chicago sports for the past few decades. Now, the general managers, they've also had some stability here. Ron Schuler was the GM for a decade in the 90s, from 1990 to 2000. Then Ken Williams was the GM for about another decade, from 2000 to 2012. He's the executive vice president since that role as GM ended. And Rick Hahn is the current GM. He's been there since 2012 as the GM. So, I think when you have such stability, it bodes well on the club. If you need to replace guys every few years, then they're not doing their job. So these guys have been there for a while. So what do you think about the GMs?
Well, lesson learned too for Reinsdorf, because I think he had as many GMs in the first handful of years as owner as he has in the period we're talking about. And, that was he hired Hawk Harrelson as GM for a year, from the broadcast booth to the GM chair. So, whether that's incidental or not, certainly that stability does provide it. And when you look at the fact that you've got now Williams and Hahn pretty much this entire century, it's been the same, more or less the same brain trust running the team, again, for better or worse. At least I think there's something to be said for that stability. It's certainly, as we may be discussing about managers here very soon, it doesn't necessarily bring an influx of new ideas and new thinking and progressiveness. And I think that's the criticism. That's the downside of this GM decision. But certainly loyalty, I don't think you can find an owner who's more loyal in probably across sports, and certainly in the game of baseball, than Reinsdorf. And there's a lot to be said. It brings a collegial and familial atmosphere to the front office. Again, has its downsides, but I think you can applaud him for that.
All right. And they've had a few more managers in this period than they've had GMs and owners. And we'll start with this manager. I've got a little fact on him. I'm testing your knowledge of the manager, see if you can pull these guys from this fact. This first guy, it was actually tough to pull something on him. So good luck with this guy. He's local to me. He attended high school in Santa Monica, but he's currently a travel ball coach. He coaches a 17U team outside of Memphis.
Well, to have gone from a major league manager to that would tell me it would be somebody who maybe didn't do too well managing. I don't know. We're starting this with Gene Lamont and Terry Bevington. I would guess Terry Bevington, just because it seems like the guy has gone into absolute obscurity, and perhaps deservedly so. But that would be my guess.
That's correct. Yeah, Terry Bevington. Bevington. He was the manager from 95 to 97. And after him, they had a manager who so this manager and Mike Ondina became the first pair of high school teammates to be drafted in the first round, the same first round of a major league draft. They both attended Cordova High School in Rancho Cordova, California, which is up by Sacramento.
This trivia is just killing me, but I'll just try to use my my chronological knowledge to muster a guess of Jerry Manuel.
Yeah, Jerry Manuel. So that was an interesting. I mean, it must have
That's
been
crazy.
a great
Cow.
high school baseball team, right? 2 first rounders on the same team.
I remember his Topps rookie baseball card, Jerry Manuel, one of those 4 square ones, and he was looking pretty proud in his I think Tigers uniform. But yeah.
Yeah, so he was there for about 5 years, 98 to 03. Then after him, they had a manager who was the first Latino manager to win a World Series.
Yeah, you lose your White Sox fan credibility and your White Sox fan card if you do not identify Ozzie Guillen as the first Latin winning. He's the first a lot of things, and yeah, that's one of them.
Yeah, and he's certainly okay. There's probably a lot more trivia that I could have pulled on Ozzie Guillen than Terry Bevington, so that was an easier one to answer. So he was there from 04 to 2011, and he was there for that 05 World Series team. After him, they had a manager who holds the collegiate Division I record, 58 game hitting streak. He was also Golden Spikes award winner as the top amateur baseball player. He's got a gold medal from the 88 Olympics, and he was a member of college baseball's inaugural Hall of Fame class in 06.
Yeah, and before they hired him, they wanted Paul Konerko to take over as player manager. Yeah, I think Robin Ventura broke, I think his hitting streak was broken by future teammate, I think, Jack McDowell. But yeah, that's Robin Ventura. And
yeah,
boy,
that
was an era. That was a bland managerial era. God bless you, Robin.
Yeah, that is correct though. Yeah, in Ventura they were playing against Stanford, and in the finals, I think, there in the World Series, College World Series, where his streak ended. Then after Ventura, so he was there from 2012 to 16. They had a manager who, in managing the White Sox, became the second manager ever, along with Johnny Evers, to manage both the Cubs and the White Sox.
Yeah, Ricky Renteria got hosed by the Cubs when he got thrown to the side when Joe Madden came available. And White Sox liked what they saw of him. And I guess he got to manage the most painful aspects of the White Sox rebuild. So sorry, Ricky.
And then he got them to the playoffs and then got fired so that Jerry Reinsdorf could hire this man, who is the oldest current manager, or at least he will be once he manages a game here. Hopefully we start the season on time in 2021. And he will be the first manager to be an active manager after being elected into the Hall of Fame as a manager. So, I mean, I guess that kind of fits well with the White Sox when you talked about Harold Baines, who played for them after having his number retired. And now this guy is managing after being elected in the Hall of Fame as a manager.
Somehow you managed a trivia question that didn't involve DUI, Bill. Wow. Yeah, well, Tony La Russa is back, whether we like it or not. Tony La Russa is back. So we're just trying to feel excited about it.
Yeah. So what's the thought? Because, I mean, basically, you know, he's Reinsdorf's buddy, and he kind of, Reinsdorf, the way that it was portrayed to me, how I interpreted everything, Reinsdorf kind of just went over the GM's heads, right? And it's like, this is the guy we're hiring. And is that correct? Is that the thought in Chicago?
After the season, we got it straight from Han and said, listen, we're gonna for once, you know, acknowledging, sort of like chuckling. I think I even asked him a direct question, which was just like, you know, you guys are pretty insular. Why are you going outside the box now? Because he was talking, we're going to bring in some new ideas. You know, even if we end up hiring somebody, I don't know, from within the organization, we're going to listen to what else is out there, because we need to do that. We've been pretty insular for a while. We try to hire a guy who was playing on the team as our manager, you know, a decade ago. But yeah, then suddenly it took a different turn. And I think the only way to explain it, based on both Han's reticence in actually discussing, you know, the hiring process, and the ultimate choice would tell me that, yeah, this is absolutely Jerry Reinsdorf had Tony La Russa on speed dial, and every year he'd call him and say, "Hey, you want to manage?" And I guess every year until now, he said no. And this year he said yes. So guess what? That means he got the job. So there's a lot of skepticism, and I think it's warranted. I mean, certainly you can't ignore the credentials that Tony has, and certainly as a very successful manager, by and large with the White Sox in his first run managing, back when he was the youngest manager in baseball. He started, he was an extremely young man with the White Sox. So yeah, we're getting the bookends of Tony La Russa now, and I guess we'll see where that goes. But yeah, safe to say a little bit of skepticism.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. He's got he's got World Series in Oakland in the 80s and in St. Louis in the 2000s, right? So we'll see if he can win another one with a big gap in mixed in there. But it will be interesting to watch, and maybe ESPN will remember the White Sox right now.
Yeah, right. For all the wrong reasons, but yes, they will. Yeah.
All right. So that's what they're looking forward to here. And now coming right up, we'll take a look at the past with the players of the past 25 years. Let's look at this roster for the White Sox that I've assembled here. And Brett will just remind the listeners the rules of creating this roster. You're going back 25 years, and this was done prior to the 2020 season. And so we're going back to 1995 through 2019. You pick one player per year. You cannot repeat players, and you must form a coherent roster. And this, of course, is when the rosters were 25. I know now they're, they were supposed to expand to 26. So then, COVID hit, and now they were 30, they were 28, they were 26. I don't know what they're going to be this year. So, but we're sticking with the 25-man roster, and let's get started with this White Sox one. At the catcher, we've got AJ Pierzynski from 2012. He's worth 3.3 wins. Hit 278, 27 bombs. So nice production there. Nice power numbers. He was a silver slugger. At first base, you got to go with the big hurt, Frank Thomas. Got him in 97, 35 bombs, 35 doubles, led the league in hitting at 347 and on base at 456. Also led the league with OPS of 1,067 and an OPS at 181, over 100 walks. Impressive there from Frank Thomas. At second base, the switch hitter Ray Durham from 2000. He was worth 3.1 wins, hit 280, 361, 450, swiped 25 bags for the Sox that year. He was an all-star, so was Frank Thomas. At third base, we've got Rob Ventura, the former manager, former great player for the White Sox. He was worth 4.7 wins, solid defense over there at third, 26 bombs, 22 doubles, hit 295, 384, 498. Good for an OPS plus of 132. And rounding out the infield, Alexi Ramirez at shortstop in 2010. He was just about average with the stick, OPS plus of 99. He did hit 18 bombs, solid with the glove. He was a silver slugger, though. He hit it with those 18 home runs, worth 5.6 wins. So that's what I got on the infield and the catcher. Brett, what do you think of these guys? Any strong memories of these guys playing for the White Sox? I'm sure Frank Thomas has a lot of memories.
Man. Those at bats from Frank Thomas were must see. You really stopped what you're doing to watch him hit. But certainly in the 90s, and as we first come up, we just never had seen anything like him. Maybe a little bit older fan would remember Dick Allen and say, and have a similar feeling. But the damage he was doing, the youthful exuberance. I guess we see it now today when he's doubled his size in his eugenics commercials. He's just like this giddy kid. And, during his career, he wasn't really seen that way. But when he first came up, he was just this guy who was, sort of so happy to be there. And he was so good. It just seemed to come so naturally to him. He was just a joy to watch. And it's interesting, you run through this infield and, the White Sox, I guess this is probably isn't unique among teams. There's a lot of stability. There's not necessarily a lot of different names to choose from, but it's almost maybe more the challenge of picking the season. And obviously you got guys like Ventura, and Ramirez is somewhat easy to overlook. And you mentioned that even for the year you selected here, he wasn't even league average offensively, but he brought such great defense, to the diamond, and was a rare bright spot in some seasons that the White Sox had high aspirations for and failed on, and even in some of the uglier years and building up to that. So he was a guy that is sort of a core, surprisingly a core White Sox, given that he's probably largely forgotten throughout baseball now.
Mm-hmm. And now let's get into this outfield, my starting outfield. And I'm starting here in left field with a guy who did not have a long tenure in Chicago, but when he was there, impressive numbers. Albert Bell in 98, he was worth 7.1 wins, extra base machine, 49 home runs, 48 doubles, hit 328, 399, 655. That 655 slugging led the league. He OPS over 1,000, which led the league. Also led the league in OPS plus and total bases at 172 and 399 respectively. Aaron Rowand in center field from 04, worth 5.7 wins, solid defense out there. Also could provide some pop, 24 home runs, 38 doubles, hit 310 for the White Sox. In right field, another extra base machine, Maglio Ordonez from 02, 38 bombs, 47 doubles, drove in 135. Forgot to mention Albert Bell also drove in 152. And Mags hit 320, 381, 597. He was a silver slugger. Not the best defense from him out in right field, but he could mash. And rounding out the starters there, Jermaine Dye at DH in 06, 48 home runs, 27 doubles, drove in 120, hit 315, 385, 622. He also OPS over 1,000. He was an all-star and a silver slugger. So, I mean, Bell, Maglio, and Dye, I mean, you're getting a lot of pop from those guys.
Yeah, more of a little bit more of a carpetbagger segment here, because we got guys who had a more limited impact with the franchise and weren't starters for a decade. And yeah, Albert Bell, such a weird situation for the White Sox. You had Jerry Reinsdorf as a hawk sort of leading the strike. And then pretty much the first major move made in baseball afterward was the White Sox signing Albert Bell, which made everybody go, well, what's going on? Which side is he on? What's going, I mean, even Sox fans were looking at each other like, I mean, I'm sure there was some excitement about getting such a big bat to protect Frank Thomas in the lineup, and you figured those two were just going to massacre opposing pitching staffs, and they largely did. But you did have to scratch your head and say, what's the plan? Okay, so now he's gone to the other side. What's happening here? But yeah, and Aaron Rowand, the thing you remember about Aaron is just daredevil defense. He was a little bit more of that crash type of player, just throw his body out there on the field, and brought some offense, but was really remarkable in his abandon in center field. And in this outfield, he will need to have that abandon, because he's gonna have to cover into left center and right center.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's not the most mobile corner outfielders there. And yeah, Rowand, I mean, I think he really fell off after he left the White Sox, but when he was with them, he was really good, because I know he played for the Giants. Did he play in Philadelphia?
Yeah, he got traded to Philadelphia. That's what brought Jim Thome to the team. Okay. Again, controversial, because the Sox had come off a World Series win. He was really one of the core guys, one of the heartbeats of the team. One of the big cheerleaders, all the highlights you see when somebody else is doing something on the field. He's the guy in the dugout, the camera's on him. He's jumping over the railing first when there's a win. So it gutted him, because he was a Chicago guy. He's a huge Bears fan, I know. But brought in Jim Thome, you can't argue with what he did for the White Sox in 2006, even though they fell short in that strange season where they won 90 games but couldn't even get a wild card. But yeah, he did fall off relatively quickly. I think he did pretty well I think he had I think he even actually upped some of his numbers in Chicago. But yeah, it was a short period between him being a really legit all-star contender to out of baseball.
Yeah. And now let's get into the bench. Paul Konerko in 05, he was worth 4 wins, hit 40 home runs, drove in 100. He was an all-star that year. Yoan Moncada from 2019, he was worth 4.8 wins. There's been a lot of hype around him. He's finally started to realize that potential. 25 home runs, 34 doubles. He swiped 10 bags. Hit 315, 367, 548. Adam Eaton in the outfield. Decent offensively. He's got a little pop, 14 home runs, 29 doubles, and 9 triples. And he goes along with some excellent defense out there, which on this team is necessary, as he can be a defensive replacement for Bell or Maglio. And the backup catcher, Tyler Flowers from 2015. This is where I struggled to get somebody, but he did hit. Well, we'll leave it at that. He provided good defense back there. For the White Sox. So yeah, that's the bench. Konerko, that was it seems like he fell into their they gave up Mike Cameron for him, but Konerko had a great career for the White Sox.
Yeah, beloved player, unofficial captain. He didn't actually want a formal captaincy, but he was pretty much looked at as the captain and the leader there for a core decade plus. People just love Konerko, and as you mentioned, with the first base stability on the south side. I mean, obviously he performed when he first got to Chicago. He had one season, I think, right away, or maybe his second year in Chicago. It was just awful, and you wondered if he was even going to stick with the team, for being a pretty big blue chip Dodgers prospect before he got to Cincinnati. So he gathered himself and came together. It's interesting. This bench is really marked by trade. You got Konerko coming for Cameron. Moncada obviously comes as part of the deal with Michael Kopech for Chris Sale from Boston. The plum piece so far there. And Adam Eaton, he parlayed that year that you've chosen into a trade the White Sox made in also launching the rebuild to bring Lucas Giolito, now their ace and Cy Young contender from Washington, along with Ronaldo Lopez, who's still with the team, and Dane Dunning, who had a cameo with the team last year and then got traded just this offseason for Lance Lynn. So, the transactions, I guess, are the theme of the bench.
Yeah, and now let's get to the pitching staff. And again, sticking with that stability theme that we've had going on here, Mark Buehrle, in 2001, he was worth 6 wins, led the league in WHIP at 1.066. He went 16-8 with a 3.29 ERA, and shocker, he gave you over 200 innings that year. It seems like you could just take any Mark Buehrle year and throw it against a wall, and it would look like this. It seems like he'll give you, 200 solid innings every year. Esteban Loaiza from 2003, he was worth 7.2 wins. He was the starting pitcher in the All-Star game that year. He went 21-9 with a 2.9 ERA, led the league with 207 strikeouts. Interesting to see 207 strikeouts lead the league, but he led the league there. And John Danks in 2008, he was worth 6.4 wins. He went 12-9 with an ERA about 3.3. Chris Sale, I got him in 2014. He made 26 starts that year, so not quite a full season, but he's 12-4 with a 2.17 ERA. Led the league in ERA plus at 173 and in Ks per 9 with 10.8 strikeouts per 9 as he struck out 208 batters in 174 innings. Then rounding out the rotation, Jose Quintana from 2013. He went 9-7 ERA at 3.5. So yeah, that's the rotation I've got here. Brett, what do you got on these guys?
Well, Buehrle, as you said, consistent as can be and brings great defense. Let's not forget he had some real acrobatic defensive
That's
plays.
right.
Oftentimes on opening days, he was really great under the spotlight. Loaiza, phenomenal pickup. Wasn't a nobody, but got sort of picked off the scrap heap from Toronto, and then after a year and a half of pretty stellar pitching was flipped in New York for Jose Contreras, who became a World Series hero with the White Sox. So that was one of Ken Williams' most deft GM maneuvers. John Danks, another guy they got in trade at the time, just a little prospect. He's a guy who had that stellar 2008 and started what we in Chicago on the South Side consider a beloved game, the blackout game, where everybody wore black. And he pitched an unbelievable game in beating the Minnesota Twins in game 163 to get into the playoffs to play the Rays. Chris Sale, I was there for his professional debut in Baltimore. At the time, he was in the bullpen. Just a super humble, sweet guy. He was the first guy from his draft class to make the majors. He made it in that draft season. And obviously his ascent has, continued even into Boston, hurt now, but a guy who looks like he's got Hall of Fame trajectory. Jose Quintana, another guy who the White Sox were smart to make a pickup, got from the Yankees, I believe, waivers, and ended up having a really solid career on the South Side, and then flipped to the North Side in a trade that we are looking at very fondly because it brought Eloy Jimenez and Dylan Cease, two very key parts of the rebuild, who will haunt the North Siders for years to come. So a pretty nice rotation you put together.
Yeah, I know that when that trade was going down at the time, and people were saying like, "Oh, it's a win-win for both teams." But yeah, Quintana did not really work out well for the Cubs there. Now I think he just signed a 1-year deal in Anaheim with the Angels. But yeah, that ended up working out very well for the White Sox. Yeah, Chris Sale is great as long as he doesn't have to pitch in an alternate jersey, right?
Yeah, listen, that was my first team I filed the Southside Hitmen. Those jerseys, though comical, are beloved to me. And the thing is, they're considered softball jerseys, right? So they're baggy and whatever. He was cutting them. He hacked at them because they were too constricting. And he's as you well know, Billy, he's not a large guy. So I don't know. They gave him the youth size, apparently. I don't know what happened there, but yeah, no alternate jerseys, no Negro League throwbacks. Just give him his regular jersey.
Yeah, and Esteban Loaiza, he's had an interesting post-baseball career.
Yeah, Esteban got running with the wrong people, and now he's listening to your podcast from behind bars. Poor Esteban, but you got caught.
Now, in the bullpen, I'll start with Roberto Hernandez from 96. He made 72 appearances, led the league with 61 games finished. He was worth over 4 wins. Impressive out of the pen. He went 6-5 with an ERA under 2, 38 saves there, and he had just about a strikeout per inning. Keith Foulke in 99. He's got some numbers here that you won't see out of the pen much anymore. He made 67 appearances and 105 in a third innings. I mean, now you've got starters that have similar innings totals. He was worth 4.4 wins. He went 3-3 with an ERA at about 2.25. Lefty Matt Thornton from 09. He went 6-3 out of the pen. ERA at 2.75 there. Joakim Soria in 2018. ERA at about 2.5. He did go 0-3. He was worth 1.1 wins. That was just 40 games for Soria that year. David Robertson, 2017, he was worth just about a win. He was 4-2 with a 2.7 ERA. And Foulke, Thornton, Soria, and Robertson, they delivered a lot of strikeouts, all of them with double-digit Ks per 9, with Robertson having the highest at 12.7 strikeouts per 9. Bobby Jenks, the closer in 07, he went 3-5 out of the pen, 2.77 ERA, saved 40 games for the White Sox. And Jesse Crain in 2011, he went 8-3 out of the pen. A lot of decisions out of the pen, 2.62 ERA. He also struck out almost 10 per 9, 9.6 strikeouts per 9. A lot of strikeouts from these relievers. What do you think, Brett?
Yeah, Roberto, I remember he came up as a starter. I remember seeing his major league debut. I was sitting, I think, in a sports bar in Kansas City watching that for some reason. Not sure how I found myself doing that, but yeah, really strong year. Had a nice little run as a closer for the Sox. Folk is an example of a trade that didn't go very well for the Ken Williams White Sox because he got shipped off at somewhat peak value to Oakland and got Billy Cock in return. And he never did anything with the White Sox, ended up having some mysterious disease. So that was a big loss for the Sox. Thornton was briefly, he parlayed this type of great season into a brief run as closer, but never really stuck there. He was always more of a great setup guy. And he came to the White Sox as an interesting sort of bonus babies failed type of situation, first round choices. He was Seattle's. White Sox had Joe Borchard, so they decided to flip those guys because they had frustrating runs. Thornton couldn't find the plate, and Joe Borchard, of course, never did anything with Seattle, and Thornton turned himself into an all-star with the White Sox. Soria, remarkable that he makes this squad, given that that's not even a full season. He was traded at the deadline because the White Sox were going nowhere. They just sort of like picked him up on a lark, and probably for the idea to flip him at the deadline, which is what they did. Robertson was part of a big splash with the White Sox in a season where I believe they also signed or traded for Todd Frazier, a couple other guys. Just a very strange, like mid-rebuild or pre-rebuild situation where the White Sox were just trying to put off bottoming out. And Bobby Jenks, Big Bobby, World Series hero, had a real nice run with the White Sox. But by the end, I think he'd really tired them out. The guys had some issues before and after his career. And I remember being there at the end of the season as everybody's emptying out their lockers, and it was actually sort of sad. There was like nobody talking to him. I think he'd really worn out his welcome with the White Sox. It was sort of sad ending to what was a really heroic run he had as a rookie, being a World Series hero. Jesse Crain, I got to cover that team, picked him as well. And I remember talking to him. He'd bring toys from his kids, because he was a young father on the road, or young kids, and he'd bring toys and he'd set them up in the locker so he could sort of like feel like his kids with him. I remember doing an interview with him about that, and he'd explain the little different guys that he brought along with him, and just a sweet guy, a guy who didn't have much of a career after the White Sox, but really did have those peak early 2010s seasons of the White Sox, which were real memorable.
Yeah. Who do you think, if you had a safe situation, out of this group, who would you go to?
Oh, you can't argue with Folk's success, and Hernandez had some mojo as well. But in a traditional situation, you got to bring in Bad Bobby because he had the killer breaking stuff and the heat that at the time blew people away. Now it's a little bit more commonplace to be throwing 100. But at the time, this guy from out of nowhere got rescued from waivers or DFA from Anaheim just that season. He came from, I want to say, like AA to the majors that year in 2005. And, just a folk hero. The fact that, Ozzie would go out and either ask for the skinny guy in the pen, which I think might've been Dustin Hermanson or any of the other guys, or he'd go out there and call for big, he'd call him the big and tall guy. And hey, that's what he was. He came shocked. And, hey, he's the pitcher on the mound when the White Sox won the World Series. Not a bad thing to have in your resume.
That's true. Yeah, it's always great to get that final out of the World Series. So yeah, that's the pitching staff I've assembled, and we'll get to the guys who missed out on the cut coming right up. Brett, we just got through talking about my roster, but I understand you put together a roster as well. You've obviously got a lot more knowledge of the White Sox that I do, and let's see who you got on your roster. I know that some of them you sent it over to me. I see a lot of the same names, but also some different names as well. So let's run through your roster. Who do you have?
Yeah, Billy, catcher is tough with the White Sox. AJ was going to have to be part of it, and we both selected AJ. And I was going in with a backup of Omar Narvaez, I believe, from 2018, until, lucky enough, I did just happen to on a lark click on the 2019 White Sox and saw that, oh yeah, that's right, James McCann actually came in and had a phenomenal year. So good that he actually is my starter over AJ for his 2019, where really that was just based on the first half of the season. He was a killer in the first half. He made the all-star team, and then pretty much in the second half faded, but was still in the White Sox annals, a guy good enough to actually start on this team.
Yeah.
We see a lot of.
Yeah, he parlayed that into a 4-year, $40 million contract, didn't he? That great first half.
Absolutely. And you could argue that was even a under market deal. I'm a little surprised it was as little as that, given that catching is at such a premium that he could sign even for somewhat long term for just $10 million a year. Surprising there wasn't a little more competition. I would have thought maybe the Yankees would swoop in or somebody to really offer him something to be juicier. We have a lot of similarities, of course, in our lineup. Frank Thomas, 97. I actually got playing in the field, even though that is not necessarily recommended. He is a defensively deficient first baseman, but the White Sox traditionally have had defensively deficient first baseman because Konerko falls in that category, and Jose Abreu does as well. Ray Durham, one of my favorite players all time with the White Sox, and loved being able to plug him in, even though I believe maybe in a different year than you at second base. Alisei at short, as sort of a no-brainer. There are other good candidates for short, including Tim Anderson on today's team.
Right.
But Alisei, with his combination of defense and offense, and the fact that he stood out on a 2010 team that was maybe a little deficient in high WAR players, gets a nod from me. I did pick Joe Crede, World Series hero, but not from the World Series season, but from the very strong 2006 follow-up that he had again before his career because of back issues sort of went down pretty quickly.
He was rookie of the year, wasn't he?
I don't know if he was rookie of the year because he had a little slow ascent, but he did come out of nowhere and brought just incredible defense and was really a playoff hero. You could argue that if not for some of Konerko's power in the ALCS, that he would legitimately have been ALCS MVP because he had some real key hits as well. He really carried the team there for a stretch. Can't argue with Albert Bell. I mean, I can argue he's sort of a jerk, but can't argue with his production in left field and the fact that he can maybe cover the left field line defensively. And we're similar again with Aaron Rowand in center field, just a terrific player. Eaton, I put in my starting lineup in right field, in part because I think he can slide over and play center if you need him to as well. But just a terrific. Interesting that he didn't really break out and blossom as a player, even though the White Sox won that trade early and getting him from, I think he came from Arizona in a 3-team trade. But the fact that once he moved over to right field, he proved his arm could hold up for decent right field, and he blossomed on both sides. Defensively, he did better at right field and center, and also became sort of an offensive force, again, well enough to become a plum piece in a trade that netted the White Sox some real great prospects as well. And even though I think in my email to you here, I still labeled him as first base, Jose Abreu was so bad defensively, with the exception of last year, that I actually put him as my DH and not my first baseman, even though at first I said he has to be the first baseman because Frank Thomas is an awful first baseman. They had to get him off the field, but actually Jose Abreu traditionally has been even worse than Frank Thomas, including this year I picked, which was his rookie of the year season, and just he made a remarkable debut out of Cuba, and acted like the pitching was no different in the major leagues versus the Cuban league. So that's my slight departure lineup from yours.
Yeah, it's the difference is, again, James McCann is one difference. I think you got a different year for Durham, right?
Yeah.
Joe Crede's different. And then, we both have Eaton, but you've got him in there. And then, Abreu is a difference. So a lot of similarities, but you've got some added, I think, value. Durham, you got a better year. McCann, so I think it's comparable to Pierzynski, but obviously, as we'll get to when you get to your bench, your catching tandem is much better than my catching tandem. And Abreu, a lot of offense there from him. All right, so let's take us through your bench.
Well, picking Robin Ventura, no different than you, although I think you have him starting. It's pretty hard to somehow find a way to pass up Robin Ventura. And, not that these are necessarily real games and real rosters we're running into, but then you've got a little lefty-righty tandem with him and Crede. You could even have the luxury of platooning them. Jose Valentin was a guy who just jumps off the page in terms of being a switch hitter. Got hit for I think a natural cycle with the Sox. He hated the Cubs, so that was fun. He mocked Sammy Sosa and pointed to the sky whenever he had a homer against the Cubs. So obviously, both as a folk hero and pretty darn good player, he gets a spot on my bench because he can slide over and play a little third base as well. Maglio, you had in your starting lineup. I think we just flipped Eaton and Maglio, probably best, and not have Maglio as a potent DH or pinch hitting force and have Eaton out there roaming defensively. But because poor Maglio ended up playing his way out of the South Side based on his defensive mishaps, hurting himself, terrible knee injury that required experimental surgery, like in, I don't know, Geneva or something. He did something that was not even team approved because his injury was so bad, but it worked, and he ended up having a great second act in Detroit. And yeah, AJ, I love AJ. I thought he was truly a team captain, being such a feisty guy and a guy who was going to stop at nothing to win, sort of guy you need leading your team. I guess that's explains why I'm not a GM or a manager in the major leagues, but a pretty good backup catcher. If he's your backup catcher, just for the feist alone, for the fact he's going to get in and throw hands if he needs to, he's just a good guy to have on your bench. So again, we had a lot of similarities, but I think we just ordered our guys a little differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think outside of the catching tandem, it's pretty even. Again, you've got maybe some added little bit with Abreu there. I think Creedy and Moncada end up being kind of like a wash. Kind of depends on what you value, what you're looking for. I think their WAR was both equivalent. I'd have to look at their rest of their numbers to really see, but yeah, I think the catching duo is where you really see improvement in your lineup. Take us through your pitching staff.
Yeah, I'll point out as we transition to pitching, it's interesting that me as a longtime White Sox diehard fan, I've been completely unromantic about this. I'm not picking, I'm not going on a way to pick World Series heroes to get on here. Somehow I've left some real key guys off. And you to me, if we were to look at these two lists, you're the guy who's like sentimental and, I met Mark Buehrle. He was my favorite player growing up. And I'm just like heartless, like forget it. Let's just look at the numbers here. And I think that's evident in a starting rotation that, though I briefly wanted to have Buehrle as sort of my long man, but I realized that wasn't in the spirit of this. So somehow Mark Buehrle is not in my starting rotation, which is extraordinary. And I admit, I'm ashamed to admit it, but Loaiza, of course, you can't avoid him. Chris Sale, terrific 2013 season. John Danks 2008 stands out certainly, and among a roster that year that probably wasn't all that strong, so he made it even an easier pick. Reached back to 1996 to get Alex Fernandez, who again,
a couple of good years back then.
Another guy, sneaky strong career, because then he ended up going as a free agent down back home to the then Florida Marlins, and ended up holding up pretty well. It's probably one of the Marlins' early great players before their first World Series run and win. And Javier Vasquez, an incredible season, a guy that was certainly maligned in Chicago as not sort of being a big game pitcher, but he did compile some big strikeout numbers and some solid wins for the Sox. And yeah, somehow you look at this rotation and there's no Mark Buehrle, so go figure.
Yeah, it is. You bring up an interesting point, how you'd think that yours would be the more sentimental roster. When I go through these, I don't really have much connection with the teams. I'm a Dodger fan, so making the Dodger roster, that was the first roster that I made, was my Dodger roster. And some of these teams I do have more of a connection to. But yeah, and some of my guests, who have made rosters, they will include players for those sentimental reasons. But yeah, it's interesting that you don't have Buehrle on your roster. It's a shock.
He's such a good guy. He'd be like he'd be the guy, like if there was injury, he'd be ready to go in and pitch. And it's funny, when I was covering the team, there was a year that the White Sox were running a 6-man rotation, in part because Jake Peavy was coming back from injury. We had guys like Philip Umber, who was coming in sort of like out of nowhere. So there were 6 strong starters, including Buehrle. And I remember writing something because Buehrle was having a little slow start to a season, that just said, hey, maybe he's the guy when they go back to a 5-man who even works out of the pen for a while. And Don Cooper came after me in the clubhouse yelling, he's an all-star, you couldn't do it. I'm like, it was a speculative piece. I love Mark Buehrle. I'm just saying he's a guy who'd be amenable to it. It wouldn't like screw up his career. He had some fragile people, Peavy coming back from injury. Edwin Jackson had had some weird success in the game. Philip Humber had come, out of nowhere. And I just thought, hey, as a temporary measure till somebody invariably gets hurt, but yeah, that was a fun little highlight where he was all up in arms and doing his Yosemite Sam thing to me because I dared to say that Mark Burley might miss a couple starting turns. But listen, Mark, love you. You'd be on my team. You were my long man, but I realized we sort of really didn't do men in this experiment. So sorry, you were my final cut.
All right. And so if he's not the long man in the pen, who do you have in the pen?
We've got Jesse Crain, like you, that great 2011 season he had for the Sox coming over from Minnesota. I found a reason, probably mostly because 2015 season was so awful that Matt Alberts makes this is a guy I would never have thought would be on my all-time 25-year team. But yes, Matt Albert makes it mostly because his teammates were lousy and not because he was so great. But Cliff Politte, a guy overlooked from the World Series season. Now, it's interesting the World Series season had such great players, legendary players for the White Sox. They won the World Series, but individually there weren't incredible WAR numbers, incredible MVP type performances. And Cliff Politte, a guy again who quickly descended then into obscurity, had an incredible year. Him and Neil Kotz were like this old man, young man tandem, though Cliff was still pretty young. And interestingly, given I keep talking about covering the team, he was the first guy that 2005 season I interviewed for the Sox program in the clubhouse. And that's not why I chose him. His numbers were there, but polite guy. And, he was doing a lot of mentoring of other guys.
It makes sense. It makes sense that he's a polite guy.
Yeah, right. And, he's, the weird assemblage. I believe the White Sox ran through 3 closers that season because they started off with Shingo Takatsu, who sort of lost his effectiveness during the season. Dustin Hermanson was a guy who'd had a lot of back injury. He had got brought in and he was their main closer. And then, of course, at the end of the year was Bobby Jenks. So somehow they made it work. And a lot of it was luck, of course. But, then you have some steady hands like Cliff Politte who, really delivered an incredible year. And again, if you were to pick somebody from 2005, if most even fans even remembered he was on the team, they certainly wouldn't have chose him. So, Joakim Soria, of course, with his weird little mini year, playing really well up until the All-Star or the trading deadline where they shipped him off. David Robertson is a guy I think we both have in our pens who stood out again, maybe less for how good he was, but really maybe the fact that the rest of his roster that particular season was pretty weak. Matt Thornton, we both have because he had a couple really stellar years as a setup guy for the White Sox, very impressive. And Keith Folk, I designate as my closer, but that's just because he had that stratospheric WAR numbers, which are really impossible to believe. How in the world can you even manage to compile this? And I understand a little bit of his product of innings, but holy cow, what a season. And now I think, how in the world could the White Sox have traded the guy? But okay, well, that's part of the experiment.
Yeah. Now it's, putting these rosters together. I mean, we both obviously have different rosters, have some names who, the other one did not have. Were there other guys who you considered? I mean, I know you mentioned Burley as the obvious one who did not make your roster. Were there any other names who are not on either your or my roster who you feel deserve recognition?
I think, referring back to the fact that 2005 was such an assemblage of talent, and a lot of it was, flash in the pan talent, guys who had years they never had again. Tadahito Iguchi from 2005 is a guy who the White Sox signed without even having seen in person. Ken Williams had only scouted him via video, but the White Sox had a need at second base. He plugged in right away. He had obviously been a professional in Japan for years, so it wasn't as if he was just plucked out of nowhere, but fit in incredibly right away. Had some amazing defensive highlights, some great postseason highlights. He's a real glue guy from 2005 that, again, maybe more as a product of the fact that there weren't a lot of standouts from the 2005 team WAR-wise that would get consideration, and he at least briefly was in my lineup and then got bumped by Politte. And I think I mentioned to you that that the numbers choice would be to pick Anthony Swarzak from 2017 because he had a better WAR than Robertson.
Hmm.
But the guy's sort of a jerk, so I'm cutting him from my team, even knowing he would be a better addition. And some of these, and I'm sure you've experienced this in many different rosters. I don't know, maybe not the Dodgers, but a lot of teams that have ups and downs. Some of these years, man, it's like, can I pick anybody? You look through like a top 10 WAR and you're like, holy cow, like the seventh guy on this particular roster is like a .7 WAR. How in the world was this team even allowed to play 162 major league games? So those are always pretty entertaining for me. And I think like you, sometimes it's less the player choice as it is how you fit the seasons in, because a guy like Magglio Ordonez had a number of consistently good seasons. So it's like, which one then do you pick?
Yeah, yeah. The other names I know, I didn't get Abreu on my roster. He's had a lot of good years, and obviously 2020 was not part of this time frame. He was the MVP in 2020. Tim Anderson, he won a batting title a couple years ago. Scotty Podsednik was another guy that I kind of, he wasn't like a great player, but I associate him with those White Sox. And an interesting thing I came across when I was going through this, he was obviously not a power hitter, so you're not going to expect him to hit many home runs, and he didn't hit any home runs in 05. And then he hits 2 home runs in the postseason, including was it a walk-off in game 2 of the World Series?
The walk-off. I mean, I was there, and I'm sure I was just like turning to my dad, just like sort of chatting, mumbling, because he comes up and he leads off. It's like, okay, whatever, maybe he'll bunt and get on or whatever. And he hits a home. I mean, if you didn't know, it was destined to be at that point. And that's just, that's still early in the series. But if you didn't know, it was destined at that point. And the seat, I believe the seat is still colored out there differently as a monumental, notable run.
Yeah, I think were there 2 home runs in that game? Did Tomei hit one? Or somebody? I feel like somebody hit one. I don't know. Was Tomei on the team? Did somebody hit one?
He wasn't. Konerko had the grand slam.
Yeah, I think it was
off of the new pitcher coming in for the Astros, and that was a pretty monumental one.
Yeah, I think I came across that those colors are still blue. Yeah. I think everything that's pretty cool.
Kept the original blue. Yeah.
Scotty Podes was a guy that I didn't get. I mentioned Abreu and Anderson. I struggled to get the second catcher. I probably should have, got McCann on there from 2019 and redid it. But yeah, it's tough fitting them all in the puzzle. And like you said, some of those years where no one's really good. My general strategy in doing it is those years I kind of fill up on bullpen guys.
Yeah.
If there's a dominant, if a guy has like a year like Folk, then you take him that year. But sometimes when there's like nobody good, just get a guy out of the pen who was like decent that year. That's my strategy.
Yeah, and you wouldn't think you'd have to extend it to catchers, and the White Sox did, because I was right there with you. Omar Narvaez was my guy until I took a hard look at 2019 and James McCann fell into my lap, and Omar Narvaez was virtually the same WAR, I think, as Tyler Flowers was. So yeah, I was just going to be a coin flip of a lousy guy, the type of guy you would fill in your bullpen with. So that was a lucky break for me in looking. But yeah, it speaks to how poor White Sox catching has been post Fisk and maybe pre McCann. But
yeah, but listeners, if any of you are so inclined to make a roster, whether it's a White Sox roster or any other team, there's a link on my website, boxseatbanner.com. You can go ahead, download a template off of Google Spreadsheets, and yeah, go ahead and make a roster. If you do, go ahead, submit it. I would love to see any rosters that are created. And if you find this podcast a couple years down the line, if it's 2023 and you're listening to this thing, go ahead and send me that too. And if you've got any criticism on my roster, I would like to hear it as well. Because although maybe White Sox fans will be more critical of your roster, Brett, since I have Burley and you don't.
Yeah, and Jenks, and Jermaine Dye. Yeah, I took a pass on a lot of heroes, and it only really occurred to me when I looked at yours and said, "Well, wait a minute, who who's the big fan here, because apparently I'm not. But
well, you're the impartial writer, so that's no cheering in the press box, right?
there you go. That's the truth. Yeah, I guess so.
All right, so those are the tough decisions that we had on these White Sox rosters. We have reached the Q&A session of the podcast, chance where we get to interact with the listeners a little bit. We open it up for questions on Twitter and Instagram. So again, make sure to follow on those platforms, get your questions in each week. Our first question comes from Chris Kirk, and Brett, you actually touched on this a little earlier when we were talking about the bullpen. But he asked, what's your favorite manager call to the pen? And he was kind of referencing Ozzie Guillen in this question. And so you already touched on that answer, but what's your favorite manager call to the pen?
Oh man, if it's not Terry Bevington going out to call to the pen when he didn't have somebody warming up, it would be, yes, of course, it's got to be a big and tall, Big Bad Bobby, which, game just became part of the folklore of this guy who just came out of nowhere to really have an impactful, basically I believe last month of the regular season and then playoff run. This guy really did come out of nowhere. And yes, of course, I believe Ozzie's explanation was when there was more than one guy warming up, this is how he was going to identify Bobby Jenks, by going wide and by going tall. But I'm pretty sure he kept doing it, even when maybe it was obvious it was only going to be Bobby coming into the game. So I think, he knew Ozzie's pretty smart when it comes to knowing which way the wind is blowing. And I think he knew that it was sort of a fun thing, and that Bobby played along with it as well. And hey, listen, I'm sure from Jenks' standpoint, anything he might have found in any way offensive by it was replaced by the fact that he was now the closer on what was becoming a World Series winning team. And he parlayed that into a pretty awesome career in Chicago, which probably could have been extended even when he went to Boston and elsewhere, if not for some of the injury problems he ran into. So by a mile, by a landslide, that's my favorite call.
Okay. Now, Alex Morales always throws a few questions at me each week, and we'll start with, what was Robin Ventura thinking during his 0 for 41 slump?
Yeah, he gets up to he's this heralded guy, as you mentioned. He's got incredible collegiate credentials, including that hitting streak. So clearly the guy knew how to hit, and that's how he made it to the majors so quickly. And then he gets to the majors and he can't hit. And yet he still, I believe, during that streak, kept his batting eye. He didn't press. He got walks. So it's not like he was not getting on base at all. And it's a great question. And it speaks to the mettle of a guy who really does have Hall of Fame credentials. If you look at his WAR, and then you consider his defense and the impact he had later in his career, even after Chicago with the Yankees and the Mets, a guy who had the type of confidence in himself and just the talent that was going to come out. And I'm sure if it had been, say, during the World Series run, that would have been an issue. The fact that this was a rebuilding team, the White Sox knew they were bringing in number one draft choice after number one draft choice up to the majors, including Alex Fernandez, Jack McDowell, Frank Thomas. It's like, we're all learning together. We're not there yet. Take your time. You're going to be in the lineup. And I'm sure some of that confidence came from management to say, you don't got anything to worry about here. We want you to work this out, but we don't have anything to worry about. You're not losing your job because of this. Willie Mays had a hitless streak coming up, and, not many better than Willie Mays. So I'm guessing that it was a combination of his own self-assurance, but also management saying, listen, we're not going anywhere this year. Let's just work this through. And he didn't become a huge part of the 1990s White Sox.
Yeah. And it's tough to have that failure, especially after that, extensive line of success, that hitting streak in college. I know a lot of times when managers and GMs, and they're talking about prospects, when they struggle in the minors, they look for that because, they kind of want them to struggle in the minors so that they have that experience, and then see how they can, cope with that and recover and get out of that slump. Because, you're going to have these periods where, you're not hitting the cover off the ball. And how do you respond to that? And most of the time you'd rather have them go through that in the minors so that they know how to get through it. And when they get to the majors, they can they've gotten through it. They've dealt with adversity. It's impressive that as a rookie, he goes on this 0 for 41 slump, and then he ends up having a great career after that. So he dealt with adversity well. But yeah, it must have been interesting being in his head during that slump. Next question, again from Morales. How many Cubans have the White Sox had? Got to lead MLB. It seems like they've got a huge pipeline there with Cuba.
All of them. I think all of them is the answer. The White Sox early in the Reinsdorf era threatened to move to Florida. They were going to be the first tenants of the Suncoast Sundome or something, where the Rays play now. And you think today, if he tries to pull the same threat and hold up the state of Illinois for more tax money again, maybe he'll just go further south and he just will relocate to Cuba because yes, dating probably even before, but certainly dating to Minnie Minoso, the White Sox have a real proud connection. And obviously the fact that Minnie was such an integral part of the team, of course, as you may be aware, playing late into his life. He played, got a hit, oldest man to get a hit in the major leagues, even had an at-bat in the 1980. So he could say he also played in the 80s. Before they even had these terms of ambassador, he was a White Sox ambassador for his whole life. So that as a foundation helps, because then that helps you bring in a Jose Abreu or even an Alice Ramirez, who sort of came via the Dominican. I think his wife was Dominican and was practicing medicine there, but he's a Cuban player. Diane Viciedo made a little brief appearance with the White Sox as a Cuban player. And now, of course, the floodgates are open because you have Luis Robert saying, listen, it's between the White Sox and the Cardinals. I know the White Sox. I know the heritage. I know Abreu. I'm choosing the White Sox. And we've seen it even as recently as this international signing period where the White Sox managed to get the plum hitter of the class, Yoelqui Cespedes, Jonas Cespedes' half-brother, I believe. So that pipeline is continuing, and it's not anything you can just fall back on. Now we're even hearing that maybe Oscar Colas, a guy who sort of, I think, is punting on this signing period, did so because he wants to wait to the next signing period, perhaps, to sign with the White Sox because they used up their money with this class. When you're getting guys who are maybe willing to wait, maybe willing to take less, maybe not even seeing their clear path to the majors, but no, listen, this is a place where Cuban players have been fostered and have flourished. I mean, let's face it, Minoso is a Hall of Famer, even though he's not there yet. Jose Abreu is playing his way toward at least consideration, if you were to consider certainly his whole international career. These guys have made big impact with the White Sox. They've been allowed to flourish. And just this past year, this mini season, the White Sox had a batting order that began, I believe, with 4 Cuban players for the first time in Major League history, because we have now Yasmani Grandal, also a Cuban player, though we don't necessarily think of him that way because he's more in the Palmeiro or Canseco class of guys who just were pretty much born when young. So I mean, there's a proud heritage here that at first you might have considered maybe more trivia, but now, I mean, this is a real thing. And so I don't think the answer can really be taken too lightly. Just say all of them.
Now they just got to add Puig to the outfield then.
Yeah. I mean, before all of his personal off the field issues, I was a huge proponent of bringing in Yasiel because I thought he could really add to this team. There's a reason why, and I don't think the White Sox knew as much as we all know now, but I think Jose Abreu and Yasiel don't necessarily see eye to eye, and I think that probably he has the power as, again, unofficial. There's something about the White Sox and unofficial team captains playing first base, but as the unofficial team captain, I think Jose might have last word on that, and I think his word was no.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Morales also asked Harold Baines, where are you now? I mean, is he going to come out of retirement, wear number 3 again for them?
There was a rumor that he was going to be part of the coaching staff again because, he has his connection to Tony La Russa. Of course, Tony was the man, let's face it, Tony and Reinsdorf, I guess. Their first re-teaming act was to get Harold Baines in the Hall of Fame. I believe they were part of the committee that very controversially elected him through Veterans Committee means to the Hall of Fame,
Mhm.
despite the fact that there are literally probably hundreds, if not dozens of players technically more worthy. But, you know, always feels bad to address it too much because I came out critical of it. Because, I mean, if you want to have some legitimacy in your Hall of Fame, you do have to have some standard, and you don't want to keep bringing the
Mhm.
bottom of that standard down.
Right.
But somewhere in all of the howling about it, you know, I mean, listen, you can't find a more decent man, a guy who was robbed due to injury of what would have been a better career, certainly a more defensive career, because he stopped being a defensive player midway through his career, if even that.
Mhm.
And just a super decent guy, a guy that Ozzie Guillen credited a lot because he was on his coaching staff for the World Series season as a calming influence. Now, granted, that calming influence involved driving to the games together, where Ozzie just completely motor mouth talks and Harold nods, but there was something in that Zen approach to life, if you want to call it that, that somehow balanced out this coaching staff. So no, he is whereabouts unknown, but always probably ready to come back at any time. And if that's literally putting the uniform on for an at bat, maybe it will be.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, it'll make sense, right? They've got a guy, Hall of Fame manager, who came out of retirement to manage, and have another Hall of Fame guy come out of retirement to take an at bat. It is unfortunate, though, that he kind of gets dragged through the mud for being, you know, arguably an undeserving Hall of Fame player when he is such a great guy, and he didn't do anything to deserve to have his name tarnished. You know, they put him in there, and now he gets kind of criticized for being a less than worthy player. It's unfortunate that his name gets mentioned in that.
And when you hear him talk about it, I mean, his father, I believe, I don't think actually was a Negro League player, but I think he had the ability to. He just had to make different life choices to support his family. And to see him tear up and realize that, you know, his dad wasn't going to be, you know, there to see him inducted, and just the incredible heart. I mean, the sense of family that, I mean, his decency just oozes out of him for a guy who doesn't speak. I mean, it really does. And it is a shame that now he is sort of the poster boy as like the weakest Hall of Fame guy in the Hall of Fame. But when in terms of all around character and decency, he's definitely far from the worst Hall of Famer. That's for sure.
Yeah. You know, you talk about the character, and I know there's the infamous character clause in the Hall of Fame voting. And I think a lot of people bring it up to talk about why they don't vote for a player into the Hall of Fame, but people don't talk about using it to vote a player into the Hall of Fame. And obviously, if you're just a great guy, that's not enough to be a Hall of Famer. But if you're like on the border there and you're a great guy, that could be something to push you over the edge. And I don't think that's discussed as often enough as it maybe should be.
I imagine that came up in the debate that they had, to whatever degree they had it, in that Veterans Committee, was, listen, all right, the guy's got the numbers, and just let's look at who he is. And if there's a tie in your minds, all right, push it over because of what he's been to this game. And you know, as you say, the good character. You're right. It's very easy to start excluding the Schillings and Clemens and Bonds from the Hall of Fame, and Pete Rose, and it's a legit clause, even though it's very ambiguous. But how about a couple times? And you know, there are other guys as well who were more like folk heroes that sort of use that to sweep their way into the Hall of Fame. But I don't know if we've seen anything recently as stark as Harold Baines getting in significantly because he's a good guy. And hey, listen, we could probably use more good guys in the Hall of Fame, so let's let more Harold Baines is in.
Okay, last question from Morales. Did AJ cheat versus the Angels in 05?
You know, AJ's a guy, he's just going to win by any means necessary. And this probably wasn't even his most dramatic act as a White Sox player of skirting the rules, if you want to say. You know, when you think, you go back and forth, I'm a guy who does not, I mean, I was there at the game. I was behind the plate, far up behind the plate. So there was no perspective on ball hitting the dirt. Not that anybody has the eyesight to be able to see that and to see a little puff of dirt or not. But I do remember being like, well, what is he doing? I mean, I guess the thought was maybe somehow the ball hit him or something, because it's like, why is he on first base? And there was puzzlement. I mean, you heard it throughout the crowd, like, what is going on here? And listen, you take a shot. There was some instinct in him. I don't think he went up to the plate saying, you know, if I strike out, I'm going to run to first. That's my strategy, right? I mean, I'm guessing he never did that in his career. I don't remember seeing it any other time, because if for no other reason, at some point somebody say, all right, we're on to you now, stop doing it, right? So there was an instinct that said, listen, I think that hit the ground. And if it's close, he definitely saw the ball getting close to trapped. He's a catcher. Why not? And the fact that Josh Paul so casually just rolled the ball out, it's like, okay, of course, this is a no-brainer. Hey, listen, I don't blame him for taking a shot. I mean, does it feel as dirty as having, some outright cheating, or a guy who was pumped up on who knows what, hitting 8 homers in, game 7? No. Was it curious? I mean, listen, it held up. And even today, even though I technically still don't see the ball hitting the ground when I look, I can't say definitively one way or the other. And it does seem like the play on the field was what happened. It wasn't as if somehow there was a reversal of what happened. I mean, there's even like some debate about whether he made the gesture of strike or the gesture of the ball hit and you need to tag him. So the fact that there's enough question, I mean, this is the ALCS. This was a desperate time for the White Sox. They were on the verge of going down 0-2 there. So, you do what you need to do. And he could have easily been told, what are you doing, you clown? Get behind the plate. You got a 9th inning to catch now. And instead they said, all right, he created enough question in me. You get first base. And the rest is World Series history for the White Sox. I'm sorry, Angels. I'm very, very sorry, but that's sorry. We got the World Series out of it. Sorry.
Is there anybody? I mean, I guess I might be able to think of a couple guys, but is AJ just absolutely loved among White Sox fans and hated by everywhere else? He seems like the guy that you love him when he's on your team and you hate him if he's not.
He's absolutely that kind of dirtbag guy where, and the funny thing is, I mean, the other place he made his bones in his career was Minnesota. And that's a division rival coming to the White Sox. I'm sure there are even fans that are like, oh, come on, he was on the Twins. We don't want him. If there wasn't such a desperate catching situation for the White Sox, I'm sure at the time, there probably would have been more pushback. Like, why are we bringing a Minnesota Twins guy who got run out of San Francisco to get here? So, yeah, I mean, you'd have to put him in, I don't want to necessarily elevate him to all-time legend like a Pete Rose, but I mean, that is clearly a dirtbag. Do whatever you can to win, really by any means necessary, including jawing, getting in guys' heads. I mean, I think AJ overall gets a pretty bad rap. I think he's an extremely intelligent player. And I think it's overlooked in the fact that he's willing to do whatever he needs to win. I mean, listen, he got punched in the big brawl between the Cubs and the White Sox in 2006. He didn't do the punching. He knocked Michael Barrett over, and then Michael Barrett decided to punch him. But of course, AJ ends up somehow being the bad guy, even though he's not the guy with the anger management problem. It's the Cubs catcher. So I think a reputation starts to follow you. And listen, he doesn't care. Look how long a career he managed to parlay into being a guy who just like is scrappy and sticks around and manages to develop a pretty good bat. So yeah, that's a long answer to your question of absolutely yes. Other teams hate. I mean, you could speak to any other fan base and let's say, yeah, I hated that guy. What a jerk. What a loser. I'm sure the Angels really love him, but there's a number of teams that just hate the guy. And it's because, listen, he's one of those who are going to do anything it takes to win. And you really do need to have at least one of those guys on your team.
Yep. Our next question comes from Dennis Costello, who asks, why wear black socks? In the White Sox, why do they wear black socks?
Yeah, there's a lot of dumbness in baseball and a lot of dumbness in baseball naming. And I suppose that's an odd one. I think there are times they have worn, those softball uniforms that Chris Sale so loves had, I believe, White Sox with just a bit of blue piping at the top. So it's not like it's never happened. I'm guessing the Red Sox haven't worn red socks every single season of their career, nor the red legs. Red socks and stirrups every season of their career. I'm sure they've done some variations as well. But listen, at this point, unfortunately, with 1919 in the books, you're probably not going to see a lot of popular movement for adopting, anything differently than what they have right now. And, the White Sox finally have settled on like a decent, uniform. They jumped around quite a bit, even into my early fandom. So the fact they just settled on this classic look, adopted by the hip hop community, whatnot, it's traditional, sort of like copping a little bit from the Yankees, but bringing in sort of some traditional logo work and that. In answer to the question, they did have a sock on their shoulder that they recently took off of the uniform, and I wish they hadn't, because that sock, for whatever reason, is goofy. I don't know, why are teams called socks? I mean, this predates the White Sox, even to the original Cubs. Why are socks even?
I
How
think
does it even become a thing?
I think, way back then, the uniforms were pretty similar. They didn't have the advancements in the ways that we're able to create different uniforms now. So they were all pretty just basic, solid white, solid gray uniforms, and so the way that they were differentiated was through the socks. They had different colored socks, or maybe some stripes on the socks or something like that. And so I think that's how those teams way back when you could identify a team, and that's how the names, I think, were created way back then.
The modern player is rendering this question moot. I love seeing the socks. I want to see some stirrups. I want to see those baseball pants pulled up close to the knee. I mean, you got more guys wearing them down over their heel than you have exposing full calf. So this question may be one for the time capsule, because in 10 years, maybe we won't even be able to ask it, because everybody will just be wearing baggy pants down over their shoes.
Yeah. And I think that's also like a big league thing, because I know a lot of, sometimes in college and high school and in the minor leagues, they're mandated to wear the uniform a certain way with the high socks, with the pants cuffed at the knee. So when they get to the majors, now they're able to do what they want, and they kind of, they put the pants all the way down. They wear those single flapped helmets, which you're not allowed to do, in the minors and in amateur baseball. So I think a part of that too is just, it's kind of being in the bigs and being big time now. You're a big leaguer.
CC Sabathia, I think you're a Hall of Famer, but I will not forgive you for introducing bloomers into baseball.
Then I had a couple questions for you just about Chicago. So what is that? Is there a huge rivalry with the Cubs? Because I know that there's a few two-town cities. There's in New York, or two team cities. In New York, you've got the Mets and the Yankees. In the Bay Area, you've got the Giants and the A's. In Southern California, you've got the Dodgers and the Angels. And of course, we've got the White Sox and the Cubs, who maybe, I don't know if they're the closest out of all the two teams. I think in some of those cities, the rivalry is bigger than in other cities, and sometimes it's just one team that kind of feels that rivalry. But is there a huge rivalry in Chicago between the White Sox and the Cubs?
Yes. And listen, you can't really trust anything a Cubs fan says, but they like to pretend they're above it. And of course, they have a lot of other concerns about, like, where the tube tops are in the bleachers. Again, did beer prices go up? So they have a lot of other concerns, and I get it. It's a lot for a Cubs fans to keep in their head at any time. But yes, of course, there's a massive rivalry. The two teams are as close as any in the majors, as you allude. I think what dates the teams have been around longer concurrently than any of these two teams are.
Yeah, they're both. The
Yankees have a legitimate thing that said, "Hey, listen, we've been here all the time." The Mets just got created or whatever. So, and I think even the heritage plays a role in this too. The White Sox and Cubs used to, for years, I want to say we're talking about almost 50 years, play the City Series after the season. Most years, the teams, surprise, surprise, didn't make the World Series. So in those years, after the World Series, they would play the City Series. And it was for money that rivaled that of the World Series, because there was big interest. And the White Sox, sorry, this is just how it happened, usually kicked the teeth out of the Cubs. And usually the Cubs, because the Sox, post Black Sox, had a terrible stretch, good 20 plus, 30, even going on 30 years of really poor baseball, because the team was gutted. They pretty much had to start from scratch. They were almost an expansion team after the Black Sox scandal. So year after year, they'd go in, and you could say, well, the White Sox wanted it more because they were the underdogs, or they were the lesser team during the season. But listen, the winner's share is the winner's share. And that was big money for those guys back then. And in fact, there was even some talk of the reason the City Series got knocked out or went away. It wasn't just because the White Sox would win every year. It's because there was suspicion on Wrigley's side, who's the owner of the Cubs, that his team was laying down a little bit for the World Series in order to get the City Series money. Or that maybe not necessarily laying down, but hey, if we finish in second and don't win the pennant and get to the World Series, we still have the City Series to play. And that's a pretty good consolation prize. The fact that there's that, which I'm fairly certain in no other, whether these teams are gone or still are intact, two team cities, the fact that there's that background for the White Sox, of course, now we have interleague play, but that is big part of the heritage, which again, maybe on the north side, they want to forget about it. And I'm sure on the south side, it's not as well known because now we just look at the crosstown rivalry as just interleague play since the late 90s. But it's much more than that. So I think the fact that these two teams have been around for so long, they've been rivals, they've usually ended up on the outside looking in when it comes to the playoffs. There's not one team that can look at themselves as more historically successful, like maybe the Yankees can do, or the Dodgers can do to the Angels. I think that combines to make a real visceral hatred between the two fan bases. And again, we can downplay it because we play each other every year now, and it's become more commonplace. And, Eloy hits a home run against the Cubs and, sort of smiles about it, or some Cubs guy gets one over on the White Sox and, they can giggle about it. And it's more commonplace because we play every year, but I think there's still some real hatred, and I still think there's some real pride at stake. And until one team becomes, as much as a Cubs success, as much success as they've had here in this latter past decade, they still just made the one World Series. They did just win one, despite the fact they had an unparalleled in the city of Chicago streak of success. Unfortunately, they don't have a lot of rings to point to, and just saying, hey, we made the playoffs X years in a row. I mean, that's something. They have that over on White Sox fans, but ultimately it doesn't get you too much on the resume. So until it becomes a situation where the Sox or the Cubs in this next decade win 2-3 World Series and really establish some dominance over the other, you're going to have the two fan bases going at each other. And, the players acknowledge it. The Cubs fans might say they're above it. The Cubs players feel it too. They know there's something different in playoff atmosphere about those games. So yes, the rivalry is hateful. It's intense, and anybody who tells you otherwise may not be paying too much attention to baseball games.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, I never really thought about that, how they've both been there, 120 years about, whereas none of the other cities have that going for them. So that's interesting. Yeah, I never thought about that. And then my last thing, again, another little rivalry question: Chicago versus New York when it comes to pizza.
Well, now I'm really in trouble because deep dish pizza is not, I'm sorry, Chicagoans, listen to this, but deep dish pizza is not pizza. You can call it maybe tasty. If you want to try to make a claim that casserole is a better pizza than pizza, I can't go there. So I am team New York when it comes to pizza, because that's pizza. I might not want it quite as greasy. I don't need the slice to be so big it's falling on me. But yes, thin crust pizza is pizza. Deep dish pizza is casserole. So absolutely, I'm sorry to betray any of my fellow city men and women, but I am New York style pizza.
Do you like Chicago style pizza, even if it's a casserole?
Not particularly. I would think there would be more exciting ways to get a heart attack than to have deep dish pizza. And so I'd rather not build toward that. Listen, if you're going to, there's a lot of options out there in the world, and I'm sure I would take that over many, many other things to eat. But no, I would just say, hey, why don't we walk one block over and get the real pizza instead of having this stuff? Again, sorry, Uno's, sorry, Lou Mal's, but I've ate enough of that for my life. I'm going to just make better selections, and that's going to include, sorry guys, New York style pizza.
No recommendations for a Chicago style pizza place?
I'd be betraying myself. Listen, I name checked Lou Malnati's, but I can't hardly endorse that slop. Again, I'm sorry guys. You can go to those places and probably still find a way to order something that resembles actual food that, you'd feel decent about eating, but it wouldn't be that. So no, in good conscience, I cannot make that recommendation.
So should Chicago like ditch the pizza and just stick to the Chicago dog as their food item famed to claim?
Nobody can argue with that, especially if you manage to take the ketchup and put it way over here in the condiments so people don't see it. Yeah, absolutely. Go with the Chicago dog. There's plenty of culinary masterpieces or just plain old slop food that people love in Chicago to not have to keep going to this whole pizza debate, which is just foolish, foolhardy. Yeah, come on. That's the choice to make, Billy. If you have to choose deep dish pizza, opt for a hot dog.
All right. So the people can eat deep dish pizza and eat their hot dogs with ketchup, and they can, be shunned, but stick with the New York pizza and stick with the Chicago dog.
In my book, I think those are the ways to go.
Okay, there. We've got a definitive answer there. So thank you on that. We're almost through the podcast. We just got a couple more things to go over here, but yeah, those are the questions. They were fun to answer those questions with you, Brett. And then coming right up, we will grade the roster. Brett, we just mentioned that we'll grade the roster, so I will ask you first to grade the roster that I've created. What do you think are some of its strengths and weaknesses, and what letter grade would you assign it? And this is grading it against all the other rosters that I've created, which obviously I have an advantage. I've got all of that information. You can kind of hypothesize with some of that. But yeah, how would you grade it?
Well, we had a lot of similarities, so of course certainly not gonna be too harsh. I think defensively, we've got strong infield defense. We've got more questionable outfield defense. I think that's an identified weak spot. Catching, unfortunately, and that speaks more to the White Sox themselves than any choice you made, is definitely not a strong point. As much as I love AJ, interesting in the starting rotation. You've got 3 southpaws, which I guess depending on who you run up against, that's either going to be really good or real trouble. In fact, I'm sorry, you have 4 left-handers. So poor Esteban Loaiza, if he can break through the bars and get out of jail to pitch in anything that you run him out against, a lot of pressure going to be put on him as the only right-hander in the rotation. And the bullpen, I sit back and I think this is I know we're using the same 25-year window, but I don't want to get down on my White Sox too much here, but I mean, I don't think we can give this team an A, because they just have to probably more traditionally be stronger years. And again, maybe this is just how the puzzle fit together for you and the White Sox, but I also can't give them any worse than a B, because I'm a White Sox fan and I'm smart enough to know they're going to create some havoc for some teams when you eventually face them off against one another. So let's just give this White Sox team a B. I think we've got some real strong power numbers. I think offensively, this team is going to do some real damage. Defensively, they might struggle catching the ball. And in the rotation, if they run up against a team with really strong right-handed power, which probably a lot of teams are, they could run into some trouble with their starters, given that 4 lefties are being run out here. So let's be both diplomatic and confident and say a B for this White Sox roster.
Yeah, as I look at them, they've got some good home run totals. They've got some good power there with the Big Hurt, with Bell, with Maglio, Konerko, Jermaine Dye. So they've got impressive home run totals, which is a strength of the offense. But they're kind of average-ish everywhere else offensively when I compare, maybe a little bit above, maybe a little below in certain categories. Left side of the infield is pretty strong with Ramirez and Ventura there. Center field, Rowand is decent, and then Eaton off the bench is decent. But yeah, everywhere else, you talked about Frank Thomas and his lack of defensive ability, and obviously the corner guys, Bell, Maglio, Jermaine Dye, none of them are providing great defense out there. So feel like that is, if they keep it on the left side of the infield, they'll be all right. But outside of that is where they'll struggle defensively. And yeah, we mentioned catcher as a weak spot. Your roster had much stronger catching duo than mine. Their starting rotation, Chris Sale, I think, has true kind of ace stuff. The other guys are, their ERAs are not sparkling, but their ERA pluses are pretty impressive for the most part. But still, they're aside from Sale, they feel like a collection of good, not great starting pitchers, and being left-hand heavy may hurt them. But they do have some big arms out of the pen, which can make up for that. And most of them are righties out of the pen, so that can make up for that. And I like the K per nine that the bullpen provides. And the pitching staff does limit walks, which is always a good thing. So I think that they might be better than what the ERA tells us, but still, I think overall, they're kind of average-ish. I'm giving them, I'm not the White Sox fan, so I'm not as, maybe not being as diplomatic as you are, but I'm going to give them a C minus. But yeah, listeners, if you want to chime in, tell me why I'm wrong, tell me why this is a better roster than a C minus roster. Go ahead. If you may agree with Brett on the grading. That's fine with me. And the inbox is open if you want to tell me why I'm wrong. And this is why this roster would beat all the other rosters that I've made.
We just need some miracle home runs. We finally face them off. We need miracle home runs and incredible low hit games or no hit games. That's all. Just ask Mark Burley to throw another perfect game.
Yeah, that's all. And you never know how the games would actually play out. It is interesting to discuss that and have that discussion, but that's what I'm going with. We have reached the end of the podcast. So Brett, thank you for joining me. And I want to throw it to you for your final thoughts on the White Sox. What do you want to share with our listeners?
Well, when you want to do a 35-year roster or 30-year roster, some of the young talent that the White Sox have right now may find a way to squeak their way in, like Luis Robert, Moncada you had, but maybe you'll get a better season from him. Lucas Giolito, who was, I think, right on the cusp of probably making both of our rosters, will probably find his way in. So who knows? Maybe the team itself will be strengthened overall, and we'll find a way to be a little bit more of a powerhouse. Maybe next time you decide to run this, because right now, yes, I can see this as being an average team at best. But the White Sox on the field right now are hopefully better than average. And no matter what Tony La Russa has up his sleeve, hopefully it's only good things. And the White Sox are in store for a really strong season and a pretty wide open AL Central this season. And hopefully they can outperform their PECOTA projections and crack into 90 wins and become more of a playoff force this year. I know there is more hype that is backing them up right now. I think they're a more hyped team than maybe they have the metal to prove that hype. So hopefully they can prove some naysayers, like even myself, wrong and bust into 90 wins, take a division and become a force sooner than later. Because who knows, we may be talking a lot more next year if we have no baseball, as it seems like the Players Association owners seem like they're destined to end up doing to us. So we might be talking exclusively out of the park in the future. But for this year, let's enjoy it. And, if you're just flipping channels looking for games to watch, stop on the Sox because they are a lot of fun. If nothing else, they are a lot of fun.
Yeah. I know I touched on it earlier, but I don't feel like people talked about that World Series drought in the South Side as much as probably should have been discussed. I mean, maybe that's a good thing for White Sox fans. You don't want to hear how long it's been since your team won the World Series. I know as a Dodger fan, it was getting tiresome to hear how long ago 1988 was. But, the main thing is too, that not only was the drought talked about, but ending the drought was not talked about enough. You mentioned, ESPN wouldn't even mention it. So I feel like that's kind of, something that the White Sox deal with. Coincidentally, their ending of the drought came the year after. Again, as we mentioned, Boston ended their drought. But after that, they were not kind of able to continue that window of contention. But as you just mentioned, I mean, they look really formidable right now. They've got some young talent. They've added some pitching. You know, they got Lance Lynn for this year, who could help bolster their pitching staff. You know, they were in the postseason last year. They look ready to contend this year as well. They've got some great young talent. They've got the MVP coming back. You know, Giolito finally's kind of figured it out. I know he was a top prospect coming out of high school, and it took him a while to realize that potential. But I mean, he pitched great last year. So, you know, they've got Tim Anderson at short. They've got a lot of talent. They've got exciting players, and they've got Tony La Russa at the helm, which, I mean, I'm getting my popcorn out, and I'm going to be tuning into these White Sox games. So we'll see how successful they are, but they've got a talented team, and there's going to be plenty of things to watch on the White Sox this year. So I know I'll be tuned in. And yeah, hopefully, you know, we know that we'll get a 2020 season as long as, you know, I mean, if we played last year, did I say 2020 and 2021? Because, you know, we got through this pandemic, hopefully but we'll see what happens after this year. Enjoy this while we can, right? So Brett, it's been a lot of fun talking the White Sox with you. You've brought a lot of knowledge. You put a great White Sox roster together, and yeah, it's been a lot of fun having you on the program. So thank you for joining us here.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Always fun to talk White Sox. Doesn't always happen, so it's fun to do.
All right, this is Billy Ballas of Box Seat Banter signing off.